Hello, everybody. Welcome to Eric and Emma's Q&A. We should come up with a better name for these, Eric, while
I know.
we're going to keep going with them. Got to come up with something like E. I don't know. There's probably something we could do with the double E there. I'm just not feeling creative enough right now. We'll come up with it. But for those of you who are joining us, whether it be on LinkedIn or YouTube or Facebook, we are coming at you because we went live on TikTok about 2 weeks ago, which some folks should hopefully be tuning in there as well. And as we were on that live, we got cries for people who wanted to continue to see the collaboration of us talking about transformations and our experiences there, and specifically some questions surrounding sales, software sales, what happens in that process, and all of the different components that come up there. So Eric and I are going to start kind of where we left off with the live stream last time, but broadcasting it to even more friends this time around. And we're going to continue to take questions from the audience. So whatever platform you're on, tippy tap those questions or comments in for us, because that's what keeps it going and keeps it interesting and why we're going live in the first place. But for anybody that doesn't know you, Eric, can you start with a quick introduction?
Sure. So I'm Eric, and much like you, Emma, I've been in the enterprise tech space now for some time, 27, 28 years, and have worked on a lot of different gnarly, complex projects. I own a tech agnostic consulting firm called Third Stage Consulting, and I also am co-owner of an IT and ERP staffing company. So we're agnostic. We help clients through their transformation journeys, whichever platform they might be looking at or implementing. So good to be here today.
Well, I'm glad to have you with us. My name is Emma. For anybody who isn't familiar with me that might be watching on Eric's channel, I have about a little over a decade of digital transformation experience tied mostly to the software sales side of things that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And currently am the co-founder of Roll Off Consulting, where my husband and I help companies with all aspects of what we call digital leadership. So that's tied to some of the stuff that I am confident we are, in fact, going to be talking about in the world of transformation today, like change management, vision, clarity, all of those components, as well as how do you build a brand that allows you to educate as your way to grow your business. And so kind of the different aspects of internal and external leadership there. So we've got some folks tuning in on the LinkedIn side. Hello, Richard. Great to see you here from Dallas. Now I've got to be careful. This is going to go over your face, Eric, if I pull up too many comments. But to get us started, Eric, I know you and your team do a lot of work in the expert witness space. So I'm opening with a doozy. And I want to say, like, out of all of the different stories that you've seen surface in this work and seeing kind of the deep, dark underbelly of transformation, what is the most outrageous or like egregious sales faux pas or lie that you've seen play out in that dynamic?
Yeah, when you mentioned that you were going to open with that, first of all, I think it's a great way to open because it'll hopefully stir up some conversation, or I'll be curious to hear if others have seen anything remotely like this. But, one thing I'd say is, like, I'll start with like the common stuff we see, which is not the biggest story. We commonly see exaggerations of software capabilities and showing, demoing functionality that's not quite ready yet, but it's going to be in the next product release. We promise, we swear, et cetera, et cetera. So we see a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of severely underestimating project timelines and budgets, underestimating risk, underestimating resources required. All that stuff, I hate to say, is very common. And I know you've had to sell against that dynamic in the past too. So I'd be curious to hear your input. But the single most egregious one that I had was there's this project that failed. So just like every failure, they'll hire an expert witness. Each side will hire an expert witness to come in and do an analysis and a report of why the project failed, what the root cause was, and then the lawyers will fight over whose fault it is and try to settle. And if not, they go to litigation. And so part of it's analysis and writing a report, and then you have to testify in court if it does go to court. And so this failure was a lot like, on the surface, was a lot like the other failures that I've been involved with. But there's this weird dynamic that I'd never seen before. Where they hired the company, the implementing organization hired basically a hired gun to come in, not as the CIO, but as the transformation director, like the program director for the whole global transformation. And this was a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwestern US, blue collar, very trusting group of people. They assume the best in people, et cetera, et cetera. Not a bad thing, but they hire this guy. He comes in and brings in a vendor and a system integrator to implement a certain software. I won't mention names, but it was a well-known software. I know you know it. Most people listening know what the software is. But the key was the system integrator, the partner that they brought in. The guy had a previous relationship with it. Like the guy that they brought in as a hired gun had worked with this company before. And you think, okay, so he's got experience. He's familiar with them. There's value in that familiarity. And the project goes off track. It's failing, and he's under all this pressure from the board and from the management team to fix it. Like, get rid of these guys. They're screwing up this project, and it's getting bad. And he refused to do it. And then someone came in over the top of him and basically canceled the whole project and said, we've got to stop the madness. And so it goes to litigation, and that's where we got involved. And as we were going through this, we found that the guy that they had hired had a referral agreement with the system integrator, and he was getting a kickback from the vendor that he brought in to do the implementation at the company. So not only was he making like $300 and some $1,000, which isn't, but for that role, I guess that's an average. It's a lot for a lot of us, but it's an average pay for someone in that role. Good money he's making there, but he was making, in addition to the $300,000 plus a year he was making from the company that hired him, he made over $1 million from the partner that he had the referral agreement with. So he was actually benefiting the longer the project went on and went over budget and things like that. So that was by far the most egregious, like borderline criminal sort of activity that I've seen. And there's been a lot of pretty nasty things I've seen, but that's probably the worst one.
I can't imagine like ethically being like, yeah, it's cool for me to take from both ends of this.
Yeah, and not reveal it somehow, not disclose it, just totally under the radar. It was crazy.
Yeah. So I like, just for me, from my like gut, I'm like, even thinking about that kind of like makes me sick to like imagine the double, it's like double agent stuff.
Totally. Yeah.
Which, okay, before we get to like some of my own experience in that side, I've been seeing this is just for the TikTok crowd or for people that fall into my demographic. I don't know if you would know this when I say it, but there's like this big case playing out in Hollywood tied to the movie It Ends With Us, and like Taylor Swift and Blake Lively's text messages are ending up all over, and like people, it's like this plot to steal the movie. And my transformation brain can't help but go to like the plot that between Pega and Appian a couple of years ago with like the corporate espionage, like people spying on things and trying to get into customer conversations and feeding information back and forth. And every time I see that kind of stuff happen, I'm like, well, all of this stuff exists in the movies because there are sadly people out in the world that do this stuff. And so like the idea that there's like a salesperson who is, and for anybody in my comments on TikTok, I've had a lot of conversation pop up about kickbacks and how that plays into all of it, and referral agreements and stuff like that. So Eric addressed it. It has been discussed. It is out in the stratosphere at this point. You can see what I did there.
Nice.
But so I like on my end, I want to like preface by I was in software sales, but like I had a company that allowed me to do it the right way, like just to put it out there. And I also, I think, was in a slightly unique position. This is certainly not unheard of, but when you go to specifically like software development companies, typically sales is focused on sales. They're not focused on also account management and long-term partnerships. And so I was in a position where it was my job to not only get the initial sale, but like have like launch to those relationships and be able to go back and continue to work with these customers and manage the account ongoing. So I think from an incentive structure, I was set up differently by being with an organization that believed in long-term relationships in comparison to sometimes what we see out in the world with just like sell it, send it over to someone else to deal with and run away with your commission check, I think is a lot of where some of these cycles get going. Yeah. But one of the things that I always talk about that I thought was so interesting when I was in this position is as frustrated as I was when I wasn't willing to misrepresent functionality or make it seem like easy breezy cover girl to implement large platforms that were changing massive parts of your process, I would get frustrated when I would hear that there was somebody else in a different organization maybe making lies or claims that they couldn't quite back up, because then you'd lose the deal, right? And but the longer that I was in my role, the more I saw what I call boomerang customers, who would choose to go down a path because they were being misled or something was being misrepresented, and then get far enough down that path where they realized that that was in fact an oopsies, and they would boomerang back and come back again. And my favorite example of this was a project that I was working on when I was pregnant with my first daughter, and I lost the deal. She was still in my belly. It boomeranged back to me on her way to kindergarten.
Oh, really?
And so, like, after the deal was closed, I was telling everyone, like, I have a whole human and I've been working on this deal since before she was even in existence. Like,
Yeah.
that's how long sometimes this takes if you're doing it the right way. And that's just kind of like always what I go back to is like that one deal literally took as long as my kindergartner took to like get to that point, because I was going to go down the path in a way that made sense for me, that I felt like I could stand behind and I could support from that standpoint.
Yeah. You really have to play the long game and be comfortable with that. I think the problem, though, it sounds like you were in a different position just because the company you work for valued the integrity. But the problem you have with, especially the bigger system integrators and vendors is they're focused on immediate results. This quarter, what are you going to close? I don't care about a boomerang 3, 4, 5 years from now. I care about what you're getting closed this quarter. And that's
I still had the pressure to close, right? Like, so there's like, I can see that again, if you don't have the incentive structures for long-term relationships, I could see how someone would be lured down that path. This is not to like say that it's good or like whatever, but I understand how it happens, to your point, when you've got pressure coming down from people above you saying like, we need this deal closed. I don't care what it takes, get it across the finish line. But like that mentality is why there are so many videos out on the internet of people making fun of salespeople who like lie and product is behind them being like, that's not a thing. We don't have that. Like, what are you talking about? Because the incentive structures are all stacked in the wrong way.
It's true. It's a good point. And there's a lot of systemic problems in this industry. And that's one of the leading ones, I'd say, is the incentive structure for salespeople, because you're incentivized and rewarded for telling people what they want to hear during the sales cycle, not what they should hear. And those are two very different things.
Josh in the comments said that there's another like spy movie situation playing out between Rippling and Deal, which I actually haven't dug deep into yet, Josh. So I'm going to have to go out and look into that one a little bit. I've also been trying to figure out how do I like tap into this idea of like Taylor Swift and Blake Lively of it all and how it relates back to transformation. So maybe it's like the Rippling and Deal one.
Interesting. Yeah, I have to look into that too. I'm not familiar with that situation at all.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. We also have a handful of people popping into the comments and saying, hello, we're glad to have you here. Eric and I are chatting all things digital transformation, sales questions. Last time we did this, we had a conversation about the big four. And Eric, one thing that's been popping up a lot tied to drama associated with all of this. And I know I've seen you cover this a lot. So I'm just going to, until we start getting some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm also going to need to rely on you. I can't seem to get the comments open on my phone from TikTok. Sure. So if you can take a peek when you've got a second, and I'm not asking you questions, if you want to look at that for me. But I want to talk to you about the big Zimmer SAP dumpster fire and what we're seeing going on there, because that's been another really hot topic in the comments. So anyone who might not be familiar with that, can you just start by giving like because I've seen when I was doing my research, a lot of your content was coming up. So I'd love for you to give the synopsis, and then we can talk about what we're kind of hearing as well.
Yeah, it's I'm actually gonna pull up my article about it just so I can remember the key points here. But there's a company called Zimmer Biomet, which is a fairly large multinational medical device company, and they spent $172 million with SAP and Deloitte trying to implement S/4HANA. And what was interesting is they had, speaking of being sold a bill of goods or a utopia that isn't realistic, they were sold this idea that they could implement S4HANA and save $1 to $2 million or one to $200 million per year with streamlined operations and automation, et cetera, which on the surface, you're like, okay, $100 to $200 million, that sounds completely made up. So that's red flag number
Quite
one.
a range.
It's a wide range. It's a nice round number. It sounds completely made up. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'm going to assume that Deloitte did the analysis that you should implement S4HANA. Here's how great it's going to be. Here's how much you're going to save. And then they got the implementation work to do it with SAP. But, I think the key in this case, by the way, is you could plug in Oracle or Microsoft or Salesforce or Workday. You could plug in a different vendor. You could plug in PwC or IBM or someone other than Deloitte. You'd probably end up with a similar result, not because they all suck, but because of the stuff we're talking about here, which is just fundamental breakdowns in the system, in the way this industry works. So anyway, they're a $25 billion company, 20,000 employees, 100 countries. So right there, that tells you it's a big, complex project, no matter what technology you deploy. And they set the original contract at 69 million, and then it jumped to 92 million by the time it was done. But then that wasn't even the worst part. That's, you figure, okay, so you spent 20 some million more than you thought. That's one strike. But the big strike, the big hidden cost that most companies don't even think about when they sign on the dotted lines to embark on these implementations, is how it affected their operations after go live. So they did not, needless to say, they did not save $100 to $200 million a year. They actually saw a 1.5% decline in revenue that they directly attributed to the botched rollout. Which, you think, okay, that's only 1 to 1.5%, but that's about 75 million in lost annual benefits. So you actually got negative business benefits of $75 million rather than the 1 to 200 million of annual benefits that was expected. So
the part that's in there that was not surprising to me, but also makes me sick, is that there were 51 change orders. Yes. And then I had somebody specifically ask for a video on this topic, which is again why I was digging into some of your coverage of it and other videos and content online, and I found an article that was the full timeline, and I saw the 51 change orders, so I included that in my video about it, which makes me sick to my stomach. But then I had comments coming in from people talking about being in their transformations that have gone on for 7 years, for people that are 3 or 4 years in without even having a go live date at this point, when it was supposed to be a 2-year long project. And then the comment that legit made me was somebody said that they have had 200 change orders on their project. And I again, back to my software sales days, I remember one project where we documented everything with a change order, even if it wasn't a scope change. So we were getting into egregious levels of change orders, but we were still in the 40s and none of them changed scope. It was all just documenting process changes that we had determined that were different from what the initial specifications were going to be, just so that we had everything clear on both sides. And I was getting to the point where I was this is making me anxious. And then just to hear millions of dollars attached to those, I can't even imagine how you can go into the room and expect to be taken seriously after that.
I know. Yeah. How do you have any credibility left to work with once that happens?
Yeah. So Eric, I'm going to give you a second to see if there's any comments that have come in from TikTok beyond what we have come in from kind of all of the different devices that are paired here that I can see through the live stream. But I did also see on TikTok that there was a comment about Squidward, which goes back to a live stream that I did recently with James Eric, where someone was joking around that he looked like Squidward, and I couldn't stop laughing. Oh. So I think that that's a throwback to that, if you see that in the comments. But is there anything else coming in question-wise there?
Just hello, how are you from Tihar? Josh Insurance Recruiter said happy Tuesday. Josh Insurance Recruiter also said dream team right here. I like this Josh guy. Yeah, I don't know him. I assume you know him.
I do, yes. Josh is the one who told us about rippling, so he must have been watching on two channels for us. That's Josh again.
He's trolling us on every platform out there, huh? No, but no questions yet. But we are watching on TikTok. If you guys have questions there,
Yeah. So again, Eric and I are chatting all things transformation. Again, last stream, we talked a lot about the big consulting firms. We've been talking a little bit about the sales process. So come put your questions in. So this is a good one. Can you give us an example of what a change order is in the real world? Eric, do you want to get started, or I can also...
I'll give you the high level, and you've actually, not that you've done a lot of change orders necessarily, but you've been on the sales side. But essentially, you go in with a set of assumptions when you sell software, and especially the services to go along with it. And when you're a system integrator and you sell those services, you might estimate, okay, this is going to take about 18 months. We're going to put X number of people on it, and we're going to bake a bunch of assumptions in there. Like, you're not going to customize it all. You're going to do the data migration yourself. You're going to do all the training yourself. A lot of assumptions are baked into that a lot of times aren't realistic and don't materialize for whatever reason. So when an assumption changes, the timeline isn't achievable, whatever it is, and something has to change outside that parameter, that box that you put the project in, you do a change order to say, okay, it's 22 months now, not 18. It's going to cost X amount more, and we might add some additional tasks that we're going to do, or maybe it's just a time increase. But I don't know if I've explained that clearly. That's probably the simplest way I can think to describe it.
I would say one of the big spots that I saw change orders arise beyond, like you're talking about here, where maybe we get into the project and we start unpacking something and we're like, ooh, that wasn't accounted for when we were doing the initial scoping. One of the spots that I would see this pop up often is tied to integrations, especially when you might be integrating with a platform that you haven't integrated with regularly, or there aren't, like, we could have a whole nother conversation about accelerators, but there aren't accelerators, which is just code for you've got lots of experience of working with their with their APIs. But sometimes when you get in and you say, like, yes, we can do an integration, and you scope something out, so you're talking to someone and they don't feel like they have the need for, like, real-time integration between platforms. You might scope out a certain level of data sharing and integration between those platforms, but maybe it's done in, like, a batch on an ongoing basis overnight to make sure that the systems are in sync, but you don't need, like, real-time connectivity between those platforms. Then all of a sudden you get in, you start doing your planning and like working through, like, the full requirements of the project, and you start talking, and all of a sudden the customer realizes, like, oh, wait, we underestimated how much we need that data transfer to go back and forth. And how do we then, like, get that real-time data and that true, like, API integration between the two? That might be a case where a change order would come in. So we scoped out a certain amount of work and integration work there, but you've decided you want a deeper integration. It's going to take more time and effort, maybe some additional tools that weren't included initially. So we're going to go ahead and, like, move over to this other model of, like, true real-time API integration. Then you issue a change order, to your point, Eric, that says this is the additional scope that we're putting in place, and this is the additional time allocation and money allocation that's needed for it. Yeah. Where we get into, like, these scenarios with, like, Zimmer, where there's 51 change orders, or those people in my comments talking about, 200 plus different change orders, to me, that's a signal that there wasn't enough work done in the pre-sales capacity, or enough work done in planning and engagement at the very beginning of the process to truly articulate what the price tag was going to be at the end. And that just, like, kind of either speaks to trying to shove the sale through, like we were talking about at the beginning, where there's pressures and thought process towards, like, getting the deal done at all costs, and maybe underestimating what it's going to look like to get the deal done, as opposed to accurately representing that to the customer, and or not having the right people in the room.
Yeah,
it is my thought process.
Yeah, I agree, and it's difficult because as a salesperson, you want to assume the best set of scenarios, right? You don't want to, you don't want to introduce risk that you're not 100% sure is there. For example, if you say, okay, it's possible in a perfect world, we could do this in 18 months, but really it's probably going to take 24, 30 months. It might even take 3 years, whatever. You're going to err on the side of saying, yeah, let's just go with 18 and we'll get in there and get started. And if things change, we'll do a change order. And that's where a lot of salespeople approach it. And like you said, you made a really good point earlier about how the sales rep that did the initial deal oftentimes isn't the same one that's responsible now for doing the change orders or managing that relationship longer term. So usually it's someone else that has to go in and clean up the mess. And, I know a lot of people, like a lot of sales reps on social media will comment and, about how, oh no, that's not true. I only sell successful projects. And the first question I'll ask is, were you there? Like when the client went live? The software might be working, but did the business operations work? And back to the Zimmer Biomet thing, the software probably worked. I don't have any proof that the software wasn't working, but the problem is it wasn't working for their business. Something was disconnected between the technology and the people and process. And I know you talk a lot about that too in your social media stuff, and that's a huge breakdown. And so, you could be successful technically, but if you're not successful on people and process, it doesn't matter that the technology works. And I would argue it's not actually working.
Well, and so there's a question from Marlon in the comments saying, like, how big of a part do you think solution-based implementations are contributing to these failures, i.e. lack of requirements? And I think that is a pretty significant part of this and I brought up the word accelerator in a little bit of quotes earlier, but I think that's kind of like this idea of a solution-based or out of the box, which might be a good like segue for us to kind of head in that direction, Eric, while we're chatting about this. But I do think that this idea that software can come out of the box and be implemented and give you the kind of return that companies are truly hoping for is a little bit of a fallacy. And by a little bit, I mean, it's absolute.
You mean a lot.
Yeah. We are live streaming to LinkedIn, so I don't want to get too aggressive in my language here, but I think it's a crock of shit when we really get down to it. And there are certain tools that you can implement, true SaaS-based applications that have a very specific use case that you're bringing in for that can do that. But when we get to large-scale implementations, the amount of times during RFPs that I would get the question of what comes out of the box? It's like you are buying a tool set. In real speak, you're buying a tool set that you get to use to help solve problems. And anybody who's going to claim that you can just take these things out of a box and set them down and have them transform your business isn't telling you the truth. And same thing for accelerators. Yes, you can be familiar with working with a specific set of APIs and really good at building out those connections between the platforms, but it's not going to look the same between every company, even if they have the same two endpoints. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And I'm also going to close my blinds a little while you're chatting.
Oh yeah, no worries. Well, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it best practices, accelerators, it's all going back to the theme here, which is it's what people want to hear. It sounds really good. As you're describing it, it's that sounds amazing. It would be amazing if I could just flip a switch and it has best practices built into it, and I don't have to do any of the hard work, the messiness of leading change. And I know that's a big part of what you always talk about is how do you lead change? And it's messy and it's gross sometimes and it's not fun all the time, but we want to just focus on the fun part. And I think that's where the breakdown happens. In fact, I have a video that comes out on Monday on my YouTube channel that's the thumbnail is Best Practices Are Ruining Companies. So, it's the premise of the video talks about how let's just go with the assumption that maybe best practices do exist. They do not exist. It's a load of garbage, but let's assume
Spoiler.
Let's assume they did. If they did exist, that means that every company out there would look the same. Every software vendor would look the same. So, and I love playing this game with software vendors, by the way. Oh, so you have best practices? Well, the other guys have best practices too. Does that mean your software is the same? And they'll be like, oh, no, of course not. Ours is way better. Well, how could it be? You're all following the same best practices, right? Industry best practices, no? And so then right there.
Where did those best practices come from?
Yeah.
They came from the first client that you did an implementation with in this industry.
Exactly.
Anyhow.
Or the last one. The last one I can remember was the one that's what the best practices are based on. But if they did exist, which they don't, if they did exist, though, that means you would water down every competitive advantage you have. If you're a for-profit company operating in a capitalist market, which most companies are, you are going to quickly dilute your competitive advantage, look like every other competitor out there, and it's just not sustainable. So even if it did exist, it doesn't work. I mean, it can't work. It just conceptually can't work. And so I think that's the part that it baffles me that people actually believe. And I'll get into arguments, like debates with people in the industry, say, no, best practices do exist. And I'm like, does the tooth fairy exist? I'm sorry if there's children listening here. Hopefully there's not. But Santa Claus and tooth fairy, all that, is that all true too? Because that's essentially what we're saying here.
Well, and I think I've talked about this, like my thought process on the best practices. There are things that companies do that are unnecessary steps within their process. And sometimes it takes an external set of eyes, whether that be a consultant or somebody coming from a software company that's helping you implement, to look at it and ask the question, why? Because internally you're so in it that you don't have the concept of picking your head up and looking and actually thinking through it. And the more questions, and we've talked about this a number of times, Eric, the more times that you ask the question, why, the more you get back to those answers of like, oh, well, we've always done it this way because the old system doesn't allow us to do X, Y, and Z. So we built this workaround. But that's now a cemented part of our process and a part of our institutional knowledge of how this works. Yeah. And you've been doing it for such a long time that you can't think through how to do it differently. Yeah. And a lot of times you need that external sounding board or person to push you to see how you might have some of those things present within your organization. But that doesn't mean that doing it the most straightforward way is a best practice. It's literally just thinking through what is the most effective way that we can go about this process. And the part that's really interesting to me when it comes to best practices and implementing these tools is it's not that there isn't a better way for you to be doing it or a way for you to use the technology to rethink how you're doing it, but it is, it waters down every organization to the point that you're doing the same thing as every one of your competitors, and it takes any of your uniqueness or your differentiators away if you just kind of ship off to those best practices. And depending on also, again, like, was it the first person that they implemented in this industry? Was it the last person that they implemented in this industry? You might also unintentionally be taking baggage from those old companies and bringing it into your company and removing a differentiator that you had in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, a lot of these best practices are probably flawed in that way. I wish you would have told me that before I filmed that video, because I could have included that. That's a really good point that I did not cover or do not cover in the video.
I see a comment that LinkedIn Live is not being our friend right now, and it keeps crashing. So I appreciate you coming over to YouTube to continue the conversation with us and let us know, what questions or feedback you have for people that are just joining us, whether that's on YouTube, maybe not on LinkedIn if it's not being our friend, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is. Eric and I are chatting about transformation, our experience in the enterprise software space. So keep questions and comments coming through, and we will get to as many of them as we can here in the next about half an hour. I'm not going to bring this whole question or comment up from Florent because it will take up the entire screen and I think completely cover your face, Eric. But he asks about tricks or tips to convince the C-suite to invest in governance. So process documentation, ownership, data quality, change requests, change management, and how do we, when they often never heard of this stuff. So he's talking about in maybe a smaller business environment than like the large SAP implementations and stuff, or like where the power users might be lacking in that background.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I'll give you the backdrop of why this is so hard to convince and why it's such an irrelevant point for convincing your leadership, because software vendors will typically say, we've got it covered. Don't worry about it. We will handle the project management and the project governance. But there's two major flaws with that model. One is that the fox is guarding the hen house. You've got, the project management is actually benefiting if the project takes longer and costs more money. So that's a conflict of interest right there. Second of all, the technical implementer is typically just one work stream within a broader program. And so while they might have a technical lead, yes, they'll have a lead. They might call that person a project manager. They're not the true program manager, like the PMO that would oversee the entire transformation program. Think of it as like in an org chart, you just have one work stream that's technology for one system, but then you've got integration, you've got data, you've got process management, you've got change management, training, all the other stuff that goes into it. And the vendor might touch some of those areas, but they should not be the ones managing that entire program, and nor they typically won't do it. Usually they're focused myopically on building their software, which is what you want them for, but you need someone to manage the rest of it. So I think it's a good question that you don't want the vendor doing it for those two reasons. But then to the other part of the question, well, who should do it if I don't have the right competencies in-house? This is where you have a few different levers you can pull on. One is you can obviously upskill your team and potentially hire and augment your existing staff with people that have had experience with these sorts of programs. You can bring in agnostic, objective advisors like Ema or I to help with that sort of thing. And you might need to slow the project down. You know, the vendor is going to try and force fit all their revenue and the implementation to as small of a timeline as possible because it benefits them. And the reality is your business can't change and keep up with as fast as they can implement technology. And so you might have to be the one to raise your hand and say, okay, you're telling me it's 18 months. It might actually, I feel comfortable with, 24 months instead of 18. That'll give us time to catch up and to keep up with you guys and to learn as we go and that sort of thing. So you have levers you can pull, but the key here is leadership. This is all about the stuff you always talk about, the leadership stuff. You have to make these hard decisions, even if it's not the easy answer or the easy button that you're looking for.
And I will say, when it comes to specifically on the change management side in smaller organizations, and Eric, I've talked about this at your conference a couple of different times, I always kind of default back to making change leadership and change management as simplistic as possible. So I know you mentioned in your comment, like small to mid-sized businesses, and like, how do we get them to take things like process documentation or like data quality, but then also change management seriously? Part of it is just making it as simple as possible, not because they can't comprehend complex, but if we want adoption and we want people to try and drive these things forward, we need to make it as simple as possible, because especially in a small, mid-sized business, they're juggling a lot. Mm-hmm. And so from a change management perspective, which doesn't necessarily touch on like the process documentation or data quality side of things, but getting people on board, getting people to understand the scope of what you're trying to accomplish and getting adoption can really come down to like having a strong vision for the company and where you want to go and why you're doing the project, and centering everybody around that central why. Thinking through how you communicate with people, and not like in a corporate communications, like full change management team side of things, but like what kind of bi-directional communication do you have in place with your team so that everybody understands where you are, where you're going. They feel like they can give feedback on what that path looks like, and that you're getting their input when it comes to things like process. Because especially when it comes to maybe documenting a process, really deeply understanding it, if you're not including your users in that process, you're missing all of the sneaky workarounds that we just talked about that they've developed over time. So that bi-directional communication, I think, is incredibly important, especially in smaller organizations where maybe you don't have that level of documentation. And then the last piece is like celebrating the small wins along the way, and like letting people know that you recognize the multiple hats that they're wearing, that you see the work that they're putting into things. And that can go a really long way in both a small or a medium-sized business, but also at a larger company level. Even if you have a change management team, bringing that like 3-step like thought process into leading change makes it so that every manager or every leader can attach to their role in leading the change, as opposed to thinking that it's somebody else's problem. Yeah. When it comes to data quality and like documentation or ownership over the process, I think, and Florent, I know your position is kind of like a little similar to Eric and I, but more in that solo capacity. I would spend time thinking through where you have really good examples of where not thinking through those components at the front end knocked you down in a different implementation, and speaking from that like war scars standpoint can oftentimes be a nice way of showing like I've learned this the hard way with other customers, or I've seen this play out the hard way. I feel like in a small to mid-sized business, a lot of times like that actual like where the rubber meets the road guidance can go a really long way, because those people are used to like digging in and doing the work, and they're going to take your experience of how it could go awry with stories a lot more seriously than they would of like kind of that best practice posturing that we were just talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I had to take it one step further, and this might offend some, so I should be careful how I say it, but it following best practices is, or assuming you've got best practices in these easy button, it's kind of a lazy approach to leadership. It's outsourcing leadership and outsourcing tough decision making, because ultimately what you have to do is you've got to be the one to decide like what the trade-offs are, what's best for my business and all that stuff. So I think the businesses or the teams that can do that the best are the ones that are more successful. The ones that are worst at leadership are the ones that they're going to fail no matter what technology they try to deploy, no matter what SI they bring in. The vendor and SI might get blamed for it, but they're bound to fail if you don't have good, strong leadership there.
Yeah. So Eric, another question that came in, I think more specific, probably in your wheelhouse, is what are your thoughts on SAP AI blended with master data governance?
Sorry, I'm just watching there's on the YouTube stream, there's hamburger helper discussion now, and I'm getting hungry now. Just watching. I think we can meet and make hamburger helper together. And then someone said, "I'll cook with you, bro." So anyway, I got very distracted by that.
Well, I'm glad we're making friendship matches in the comments for people.
I know. Totally off topic, but that's okay. we're a community for sure. Yeah. So I think I think SAP's AI in some ways is very powerful because of the fact that they have some of the world's largest organizations that have opted in to train their AI models and to just make their AI capabilities more effective. I do wonder, back to the point that you were making and that I alluded to too earlier, I do wonder if that just dilutes your competitive advantage now, because you're using your data, your proprietary IP, to train a software vendor's models that is then going to be used by your competitors and other companies out there. So short term, maybe it's not a terrible thing, but I do wonder long term what the long term competitive implications are of that. But having said that, I think it's a good thing for SAP. I think to be able to use that data and train their models and to make a more powerful suite of, agentic AI and all the different AI tools they're using. But I think in addition to potentially diluting your competitive advantage or giving up your IP to train others to benefit, or to train someone else's software to benefit others. The other thing there is that you're creating more vendor lock. I mean, it's just harder to move away from SAP in the future. If now you've got data in SAP, you've got the SAP applications, you've got SAP's AI, you're totally double down on all the SAP stack. Someday when the time comes, when SAP is obsolete and the next wave of technologies comes out and it's not SAP and you want to switch away from SAP, it's going to be very difficult to do. So I think the switching costs are getting higher and higher, not just for SAP. All the vendors are in this arms race to get in on the AI movement, because it does help solidify that vendor lock, which is good for them, but not always good for the customers.
Which I think is also a really interesting kind of segue that I want to come back to in a second, because I did see another question. Actually, we'll come back to the question in a minute. I've been having a really ongoing conversation with my audience about cloud hosted versus on-prem. And this is obviously something that's going on with SAP pushing people to the cloud now as well. And I think that part of that is actually vendor lock as well. And I think people underestimate how much, I think it is a larger shift if you are on a cloud hosted solution with a vendor in that software as a service, true model, to lift and shift to a different company's cloud is actually more difficult than it would have been for you to switch out your core if everything was on premise. And I see you shaking your head, but is that, I mean, that's your opinion as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's there's a reckoning on the horizon. Maybe it's a decade out, but you're going to get this wave of companies that are just now implementing or have recently implemented cloud solutions. And that next wave of replacements is going to happen starting probably in 10 years or so. And that's where you're going to see the pain and the chaos. And guess who's going to benefit from this? It's going to be the tech industry. The tech industry is going to be fine. But these companies, you think they're hard now. Imagine ERP implementations or tech implementations in 10 or 20 years. They're going to be a nightmare compared
Well,
to.
and just like even the migration of your data.
Yeah. Just getting
Like,
it out
it's
of it.
hard enough to do a migration right now if you're on-prem and moving to the cloud, or from prem to prem solution, but moving to the cloud or from cloud to cloud, and like that, I mean, it just like that part of it alone is really interesting. And I think we're seeing that move of like the final push. There's plenty of vendors that required cloud hosting before SAP. Like they are not the first mover in this space, but because of the depth of their implementations, and also how wide reaching their solution is, it feels more acute probably than what we've seen with other platforms. But there's also this interesting dynamic playing out of like, so there's like cloud versus on-prem, and we're seeing people start to raise their hand and say like, hey, actually, I don't want everything in your cloud. Like, that's just your computer. It's not like, it's not actually in the cloud. But then there's like, tied to this AI conversation, I'm seeing a lot of like build versus buy coming back up. And are you seeing that in your work as well, Eric?
Yeah, we are. And a little bit of repatriation of moving some stuff from the cloud back to on-prem. We're starting to see some of that. It's not a majority by any means, but there is a little bit of a backlash we're starting to see. It hasn't picked up real momentum. We'll see if it's sustainable in the short term or not. But I think eventually there will be a backlash. And I think we'll probably settle in the middle to where it's more of a hybrid approach. Like, you might have your super sensitive confidential IP might be on-prem, obviously with tight cybersecurity and that sort of thing. But because that's the argument I always get from cloud providers, is like, oh, what about cybersecurity though? Well, you don't need to be in the cloud to be cyber secure. So I think you'll start to see more of a hybrid model where like some of our commodity processes and data could maybe be in the cloud, and then our core competitive advantages might be on-prem. Because if you think about like the world's biggest, most successful companies like Amazon, and I'll just pick on Amazon. I mean, they did not become Amazon, this big global juggernaut, by implementing standard off-the-shelf software. They did it by building their own technology that gave them a huge competitive advantage. Walmart did the same thing back in the 80s and 90s, and that is still served them well today. In fact, when some of those types of companies try to implement standard off-the-shelf software, it ends up being an even bigger disaster because they're so used to building their own IP and their own technology. So I think companies will realize that over time, that you can't just commoditize IT, that IT can be a source of competitive advantage. And in order for it to be a source of competitive advantage, you might need it to be on-prem. You might need to build instead of buy. And if you do buy, you might need to customize more than the tech industry would have you think.
See, and people in our comments are disagreeing. They're saying, no way, you've got to be in the cloud. And I think like this comment here, like if you want to maintain and secure all your own infrastructure, I think that's a part of the conversation, right? Like, so over the course of my technology career, when I first started, there was a handful of SaaS solutions, but it really wasn't this probably would have been 12-ish years ago. There were a handful of cloud solutions, but it really was not the go-to. And people still had the right talent internally to manage infrastructure. There was still like, that was just like kind of the way that it was. And you were buying most solutions on-prem. And then like and at that point, there was still a lot of this build versus buy. And there was a lot of conversations that had to happen around that. And like, what are the criteria that you were evaluating as you made that decision? And then we got fully into like, I would say like SaaS land, in terms of what was like, and then all of a sudden customers were asking, what SaaS options do you have? Do you host in the cloud? What does that look like? And companies started to move away from having that infrastructure, having that talent in-house. And then also when we got to that point, that build versus buy question wasn't coming up nearly as much. It was, who do I go buy from? Because these solutions are all over the place and there are more options than I could ever know what to do with. So I'm going to go out and buy. But like now, as we start coming back to this idea of, is build versus buy coming back? Is it cloud versus on-prem? Those things require real talent conversations. And when you do look at small companies, whether they have the right talent to build anything out on their own, or manage that infrastructure is a big part of that equation, and whether they should be going down that path or not. But when it comes to building, I think, and John mentioned here that like migrations will become easier because of AI. I don't think that they necessarily will become easier because of AI, because they're still dealing with vendors that want to make it difficult for you to migrate off migrate off of their platform. So like the technology components of it might become easier because you're not having to like monitor the processes as they're running and that kind of stuff. So I would agree with you there, Don, but like in terms of like protecting what is yours and keeping people, these vendors are going to make it as difficult as possible for you to move off the platform. And that's always been a part of it, right? And that part doesn't go away just because of AI. But there's a lot of people that are saying like it's easier to develop now with AI. And so like that thought process is part of what I've seen starting to play in that build versus buy side of things. And then also this like protection of data. So who owns your data if it's in an AI solution that's run by a vendor? Who owns the model? Are your competitors getting value from your data training the model that everybody uses? Are you okay with that? And so some of it does play out to these larger companies being the ones that are saying like, I'm not interested in that. I want to have proprietary solutions that give us a competitive edge. But I've also seen a lot of comments from people coming in stating that they feel like AI is making this build side of things easier, even at a lower level.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's actually a really interesting point and counterpoint because, I know like SAP, for example, they are notorious for closing out non-SAP products to the point where they're getting investigated by regulators for anti-competitive behavior as a result of it in the EU in particular. But they're notorious for closing off their tech stack from other technologies. So to your point, are you going to bring in a non-SAP AI agent to come in and just get all the data out of SAP? It's probably not going to happen. Or are you going to try and use Dual to get all the data out of SAP? They're not going to allow that either, I wouldn't think. So I think it's a really good point.
Yeah. And then we do have some comments where people are saying like, customers on SaaS platforms are going to want out because of that lack of control. Yeah. We also have somebody asking in the comments if I am a shrink, because apparently my glasses are part of that equation. I am not a psychologist. Thank you for thinking that I look intelligent though. And so I want to go back to the question that I teased about before we went down the path of build versus buy. And that was, and I'm lacking where the actual comment itself is, so I'm just going to say it from my memory. But the question was, tell me about an example where someone did it right. So we've talked about horror stories and the cases that we saw that were egregiously bad. But let's talk about some of the things that we see companies doing right.
Yeah, you were actually, and I saw that question come in as you were actually talking about some of the things that earlier you were hitting on some things around leadership and change management that were so important. So I'd be curious to come back to some of those, but a couple of the traits that I've seen, like with the most successful projects and the most successful teams that I've worked with, a couple things stand out. One is like there's two in particular I can think of, actually three, that are really, like, I'd say they're the best implementations I've been a part of. And in all three of those cases, the executive sponsor was not from IT. It was someone from operations who knew very little about IT. And I actually think their lack of knowledge around IT, they thought it was a liability. And I remember in all three of those cases, them hiring us saying, hey, I don't know anything about IT. And I remember saying, this is great. You know the business and you can lead from the business perspective. The IT stuff is easy. We'll figure that out. But understanding the business, the culture of the organization, that inside and out, that's more important. And I think that I absolutely believe that. I think that a strong business leader that knows maybe not very much about technology, maybe just enough to be dangerous, I think that's okay. And I know a lot of technologists disagree with me and say, oh, but those are the same people that refuse to change and they don't understand how technology works and how best practices work and all this stuff. And I say, well, no, that's not true. They're the first to call BS on it because all they care about is business value. And if you can't justify IT from a business perspective, then you shouldn't be doing it. So they're able to make decisions a lot more clearly, in my opinion, those business leaders. And then the other trait I'd say that all three of these really good case studies consist of is that they they led the project. And I know that sounds basic, but it's amazing to me how few people actually lead these projects. They outsource or defer to the third parties, to the vendor. The vendor's telling me they're going to do this, this, and that. I'm just going to let them do it because they're the experts. These people, some might say they micromanaged, and I would say it's more of a trust but verify approach that they took, where they made tough decisions. They decided what the timeline was going to be. They decided how it was going to get staffed. If they didn't like resources on the project, they would have them replaced. If they thought there were too many people billing on the project from the consultancy, they would have those people, they would cut back and throttle back. So they just made decisive decisions, not always the perfect decision or the right decision necessarily, but they were decisive and they could lead with clarity. And I think that those two traits are the ones that stand out most to me. But what have you seen?
I think the biggest thing, coming back to what you said, is like they actually led. And I feel like the successful implementations that I've seen have always started with a really strong like leadership message of why, and helping people understand what they would get out of the implementation, and that like what's in it for me piece. But also specifically, like I remember vividly during an implementation, the executive sponsor coming in while we had everybody pulled together, and it was a large project. We had like 20 some people in the room for the kickoff, like from different departments that were all going to be a part of this solution. And she spent the first half an hour talking about why, talking about how they got there, what the vision is for where they want to go, and specifically outlining some of the fears that she knew might be associated with the project and why they were not valid, and getting everybody aligned on that vision of where they wanted to go and why they were going there. And then she didn't just stop there. She was involved and showed up for the meetings when there were status calls. She didn't just come in when things were on fire and ask for someone to unpack what had been happening. She stayed close enough to the implementation and participated at a level that allowed her to actually lead. And that should not be a scenario that is burned into my mind. Like that should be what leadership looks like when we get to projects like this, especially when we're talking about like large scale implementations that are touching almost every single department within your company. Leadership cannot just sign a contract and then like Homer Simpson into the bushes, like that meme that's out there. And that is one of the most common things. And I have, and I've presented this at Stratosphere before as well, but I talk about like my 4P for visioning, and like that's, you know, talking about the purpose, talking about and involving the people from the very beginning that are going to be impacted by the change, outlining the process of what the change is going to look like and kind of demystifying what that process is going to be. And then the final P is participation. And going to like how I came up with that framework was I made a TikTok video, not realizing exactly what was going to happen, but I made a TikTok video saying like, what do you wish the leaders in your company actually did? Like, what do you wish you could tell them after your software implementation to make it go better next time? And then what I did is I went through and I looked at those comments, and there was over 100, I think it was like 150 comments. And I went through and I categorized them, and that's where those 4 Ps came from. And by far, the most of them came from that purpose side and the participation side. And I was expecting purpose and people to come out. I was not expecting the process component to come out as strongly, and not like redesign the process, but like explain what the process of change is going to look like. That one was a surprise to me, but the biggest surprise, because it was where I got most of the comments, was that participation piece and people begging for their leadership to give a fuck, begging for them to be involved and actually lead. And so I like that, like when I look back at the most successful implementations that I worked on while I was still in that sales capacity, it was leaders that did a really good job of setting that vision and participated. And that shouldn't be rare. Unfortunately, it is.
Yeah. That is interesting you say that, because why should that be surprising, or why should that have been an aha moment for you? You know, it should have just been like, yeah, it's just like every other project. They have a clear purpose and clear vision.
We have come to the end of our time that we have scheduled for today, right in time for the comment of people saying, keep going. which I think means, Eric, that there is a call for us to do a part 3 and maybe beyond. We'll come up with a cool name for it, and we'll try to get LinkedIn to be better behaved so that everyone can stay there and engage with us there. But thank you for joining me, Eric. And everybody who joined us across various platforms and gave us questions and topics to talk about. We'll be back again someday soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone watching here today.